It's the most important thing I've ever done.
Yeah.
And probably will be, honestly.
Stick that in your pocket.
Probably the most important thing I've ever done in terms of, feeling like you're contributing.
We've got a friend here today. This is Robert Franklin. He's just hanging with me on a day off. Got somebody here I can totally quiz. If you want to know his credentials, do you or do you not have an Emmy in your house?
I don't. I was nominated for a daytime
You didn't
Emmy.
get it?
No, the program I was in lost to Oprah.
Oh,
so
that's rough.
it's tough competition.
That is tough.
Will Smith was also in there too. So
man.
The fact that we were nominated was a shock to
and that was
everybody
for
involved.
a Hanford piece, right?
It was for it was for a program I did with the National World War II Museum, which you might be like, oh, why would that be up there with daytime stuff? Well, it's first of all, if you've ever been to New Orleans, the World War II Museum isn't a museum. It's like a campus. It's like a multi-block institution with big donors, deep pockets, one of whom is Steven Spielberg. Wow. So they have an AV. They have a filming unit that is top-notch. Program called the Manhattan Project Electronic Field Trip.
Yeah,
it was
really cool. I saw it.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's aimed at middle and early high school students.
Yeah.
And really good classroom
but the
material.
Content wasn't lacking. I mean, they
no,
were hitting heavy topics.
Yeah, no, it was really fun to shoot. It was definitely. I mean, it was a professional shoot.
Right.
And I really enjoyed that process. Yeah. I've been in front of on camera a few times, but
I've seen a lot of your videos.
The most.
I love your videos.
Thank you. That was the most. It was just a great thing to do, and it was really fun too because I worked with a local high schooler who was kind of I was the talent, the expert. She was like the interviewer and kind of the host, and it was really fun.
That's awesome. A habitation here from the earliest we know.
Sure.
Okay, so. And I'm just going to shoot from the cuff, and you can let me know if I'm on track or definitely add stuff. So we're 16,000 years ago. We got Ice Age floods busting through here.
That's starting pretty far back, yeah.
There's a pretty good indication now that there might have been people here.
There definitely were. I mean, we can say that with almost certainty.
Yeah.
Knowing that we keep pushing back the date for human habitation,
right?
And understanding that there will be a certain point where we won't get the hard data because tools they use would have been largely organic. The sites where they would have lived would have shifted so vastly because of all sorts of geologic forces. Yes, we can certainly say. I mean, look, if we have evidence of people in southern Chile at 15,000 years ago, that migration would have taken place over tens of thousands of years.
Right. And as some examples, we've got the Marmas Rock Cave.
Right.
This way.
Yep.
Off the Palouse River, which I think that was 11,000 years ago, maybe 12.
Yep.
That they determined, and then the other that is in that region in Umatilla, the old town of Umatilla, they found an old civilization there, and the Army Corps of Engineers just covered that thing up lickety-split, as they did the Marmas Rock Shelter, and as they did the ancient one, who was found on the Columbia River, just a couple miles,
just over in Kennewick, and basically in Columbia Park, where they host the boat races.
And that's the most direct connection we have to the Native Americans, indigenous peoples of this land,
who are still here and have been inhabiting this space for really, they say since time immemorial, and really if we think about human species, human civilization, it would be since time immemorial, since before we began recording time. Right. They've been here, and so that that's a special connection. Yeah, and we have evidence of going back a very long time, and with the likelihood of even further.
Yeah.
Really, since for us a conception of time can begin.
First ones, I think some Canadians made it. No, Columbia didn't make it up this far, right?
There's some Euro-Americans that are kind of traipsing through this area by the early to mid 19th century.
Okay.
Right. You have some Hudson's Bay explorers. This area of the of the inland Northwest is one of the latter ones, but you do have some French and Creoles and Métis and some Hudson's Bay people coming in.
Would you say that's before Lewis and Clark?
It's
Or
around the
after?
same. It's
It
around
is,
the
huh,
same
right?
time, right? And think of, Lewis of Clark is, one very small, very weak projection of U.S. power, right? I mean, these guys are they're so weak they never would have made it on their own.
No.
And anyway, it's really not the story of Lewis and Clark. In a
No.
lot of ways, it's the story of all of the native groups that helped Lewis and Clark make it through.
Right.
Because without any of those allies, they would have died in any number of ways, either through faux pas, natural disasters. They got guidance all along the way. But yeah, so there's Euro Americans here in a fleeting way in the mid 19th century.
And
It's
first black person, African American person to set foot would be York, wouldn't you think? Maybe.
Yeah, it's possible someone with the Spanish, but yeah, one of the first documented, certainly, yes.
Yeah.
York, Clark's slave, who was also incredibly vital
Right.
to to the success of Lewis and Clark. It's actually kind of, I mean, we obviously boil it down to Lewis and Clark to like have a name of it, but it's really not their feat alone.
No.
And it's important to remember when we tell that story that it is to really put it in the context of like they're migrating through a series of mighty indigenous powers that basically allow them, assist them out of curiosity or
Right.
because they're pretty clumsy.
Yeah. Yeah, they made a lot of errors.
They made a lot of errors.
Yeah.
And having a big gun on their boat does not send the message of like peace and friendship.
No.
And eventually they take it off because they're like, this is just causing us a lot of trouble. Anyway,
So then we got-
it's not a story of Lewis and
All
Clark, but
right,
yes,
man, that's good.
They're here. We have some other trappers. It's
First town, would that be Ainsworth?
well, no. I mean, I guess it depends on what you
And
consider.
that's just south of here,
town.
right?
Yeah. So there's people settle White Bluffs, the town of White Bluffs. There's people there in the 1860s because it's a river crossing. But here where we are now,
Yes.
Ainsworth comes in the early 1880s. Yeah. So the
Okay.
Northern Pacific. Basically, this is part of their route to go to cross the west to Tacoma, and later on the Union Pacific will follow and also meet here. And so if you look at a map of late 19th century West, Pasco, we'll say Pasco
Yeah.
because it becomes Pasco, is really an anomaly in that two major railroads meet here. That doesn't happen a lot outside of like cities on the West Coast. So that makes this an important center of travel, just like it had been for indigenous peoples. This is the Tri-Cities. It's also where three rivers, the Columbia, the Snake, and the Yakima meet. And those rivers were sources of important food and materials like tule reeds and things for indigenous people, but they were also super highways for indigenous commerce, right? Where you have three rivers meet, you have interactions of tribes all over the place, right? You have systems of indigenous knowledge and trade. You have people bringing things from the coast. It's a power place. It's a supermarket almost in a lot of ways. These are three big rivers that meet here. There's not a lot of other places in the West where you have rivers of this size meeting, right?
Right.
I mean, this is
And they're not going to do it by foot.
No,
I mean,
no.
It's so coincidental by foot, but with the traffic of the river, you got basically highways. just
right, and you have
connected.
salmon, and you have a super important food source. I mean, so and you have people like the Wanapum whose name means people of the river, right? You have
Right.
peoples who are completely focused around that riverine ecosystem.
Down here would have been the Chumnapum,
Yes.
and I can't find a lot of history on them.
There's-
Did that just get absorbed?
Yes,
into Wanapum,
basically. There's a lot of smaller bands and tribes that, due to disease and warfare and settler pressure, kind of combine. They become nations basically as they
Yeah.
absorb other indigenous, and that's that's an American. That's a story of the of America, right?
Is all those smaller nations becoming names that we can identify
And often
them
for
with.
political purposes, having to join forces for numbers, to keep some degree of political power and autonomy in the face of, encroaching white settlers who, are better armed, better funded, and of course have immunity to or resistance to diseases.
Right.
That anyway. So the Tri-Cities is this place of important natural interconnections, and it's why we have such a big port. And this is why there's so much infrastructure that goes through here today, because it's kind of a natural meeting place. When the Northern Pacific and the Union Pacific decide to build, first in Ainsworth, and they move Ainsworth up because it's pretty clear Ainsworth has limited room to grow, and they don't want to be right by the river because the rivers flood sometimes, and they want to move the city up. When they plot this massive rail infrastructure we have here, they create a really important transportation route.
The rail brought in the first African Americans.
And
right?
Chinese and Japanese, yes.
Chinese and Japanese as well.
So when the rail came, the workforce that built that rail, that really built.
We're talking 1910?
We're talking 1880s,
Whoa,
1890s.
I didn't realize it was that long.
So from the beginning of transcontinental rail construction in the 1840s and 50s, in the East it had been largely, Irish and other immigrants, Eastern European immigrants and Irish immigrants, peoples considered to be non-white or semi-civilized. In the West, it was Chinese labor, coolie labor as they called it, some African American labor, and Japanese labor. Eventually, they started importing Japanese to basically create ethnic tension with the Chinese and to kind of stop labor organizing, to basically create, it's your typical divide and conquer rhetoric. Right. They do this, the railroads do it, sugar plantations in Hawaii do it. Right. I mean, this is a pretty typical Americans are pretty, having helped us. Yeah, having helped to create and shape racial hierarchies, they're pretty adept at, white Americans of the past are pretty adept at using white supremacy to their advantage. What a shocker!
Yeah, what a shocker.
So when Pasco is plotted, East Pasco, where we are today, is specifically set aside as a place where non-white peoples are encouraged to live.
Intentionally zoned.
And there have always been some white people that have lived in East Pasco, but this was where, hey, this is the other side of the tracks. This is where you live. This is your zone. This is your area, right? And Kennewick and West and Pasco, west of 4th Street, that's white area, right? And today those borders have shifted a little bit, but you look at a census map of Pasco, and you can see that east of 395 is majority Latino, right, Hispanic, and that becomes a sharp minority west of 395. Right, in East Pasco, where we are today, is 87% Latino Hispanic.
87%.
In fact, it's known by a lot of people in this community as Barrios de Negros, the neighborhood of blacks. Right, and because when Hispanic, Latinx peoples began migrating here and staying, there had always been that seasonal labor for decades.
Right.
But when they began staying in the 1960s,
opening businesses and becoming
right at the end of the Bracero program, and just due to when they began staying, that's when they basically are staying in this what had been known as a black neighborhood. Right. And so they picked that up. And even today, I've had students in my classes when we talk about this history, they go, "Oh, that's why it's called Barrios de Negros." And I'm like, "Yeah," and because they're because it's not a majority black neighborhood anymore.
No.
In 1950, Pasco is over 20% black. Pasco itself, if you took the whole city, and then East Pasco is majority black. Today,
where would that have ranked statewide?
Highest per capita in the entire Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
And the highest in the West Coast outside of Watts and Oakland.
Yeah.
The railroad was never a major employer, but we have a small number of Asian and black railroad workers.
Right.
But by 1940, there are just 28 African Americans on the census. So it's small.
Yeah.
It's a small population, an established population. One of the most notable is Reverend Coleman, who operated a church here, pretty well-known figure. He and his wife, Gladys, were pretty important folks here. In fact, they were friends with one of the main Japanese American families here, the Yamauchi family, who I interviewed. And these interviews were part of a National Park Service funded project to preserve the Black history of the Manhattan Project and the Cold War era. It's part of my second book, Echoes of Exclusion and Resistance, if anyone's interested.
Yeah.
The family was, or the community was close, right? It was a close-knit,
Right.
multiracial.
They were established. They had occupations. They had a
Right,
role.
right.
They
were also defined by their exclusion, right?
Yeah.
This is where they could have businesses. This is where they were welcome, because this was where they had been placed. They were not welcome in Kennewick. Kennewick was famously a lily white town. There wasn't a lot of overt racism before World War II because the population was so small.
Yeah, nobody was
I think
threatened.
local whites and city leaders felt that it was manageable, right? So it wasn't a threat.
Right.
Now, cue World War II. So among the many changes, there are international changes, obviously, with the attack on Pearl Harbor and the ramping up of our military. There's domestic changes as well. World War II is part of the Great Migration, right, which is this period of history from around 1910 to 1970 where millions of African Americans leave the South permanently. It's the greatest mass migration in American history.
Wow.
World War II is a major part of that because all these jobs are opening up in the West and the North that are pulling people out.
Right.
But-
We're building dams out here.
Right,
We've
we're
got-
building dams, we're building munitions factories, We're
Munitions.
building Hanford. We'll get to Hanford in a minute, because actually before Hanford, here in Pasco, there's two big things happening. One is they're building up the Pasco Holding and Reconsignment Depot, and that's what's known today as Big Pasco. That's the area, if you go down here, down to Ainsworth Road, and you go like you're going to Sacagawea State Park, you'll pass all these massive buildings, these massive storage warehouses. Those are all World War II. In fact, they're still in use today. There's businesses in them, or there's still warehouses.
I wondered what
This
those were.
was-
I saw them on Google Maps.
Okay, yeah, they're huge. It's by the new Amazon. Yeah, it's huge. It's Pasco becomes the main staging point for all war material headed to the West Coast, because again, two major railroads meet here.
So
you just have tons
Pacific
of
Theater, everything.
a lot of it is
all
coming
the
through
arms
Pasco.
are heading
Yeah.
right through Pasco.
And then being diverted to Tacoma, Sacramento,
Right.
San Diego, not Sacramento, San Diego, all the ports on the West Coast, Los Angeles,
Now, is
and
that
things like
goods
that.
and services, or are we talking soldiers as well?
We're talking people and equipment.
Everything's coming
Right.
through
Oh,
there.
most of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a major. Pasco becomes the largest rail depot west of the Mississippi.
Wow.
It's huge. And so it's not Chicago huge, but it's big, right?
there,
It's bigger
yeah.
than Seattle and Los Angeles, all these other places. So there's that. That's changing Pasco. And then the first big racial change is the Pasco Naval Air Station. So the Navy builds this naval air station, which is today the Tri-Cities Airport. If you ever wondered why, you look at Tri-Cities
huge.
and you look at the airport, it's massive.
It
And
is
you're like,
huge.
why does this community, which today we're the fourth largest metro in
Right.
Washington State, but 30, 40 years ago,
Right.
why would we need such a massive airport? That's where the Navy trained all its pilots. So you have hundreds and hundreds of planes, hundreds and hundreds of pilots being trained in that airfield. Well, when the Navy builds it and the city's happy to have it, there are hundreds of black naval servicemen that come. And this is where you start to get the first inklings, the first evidence of a real racial fear and racial tension on the part of local whites and city officials and the police. Because immediately there start to be reports in the Pasco Herald, now the Tri-City Herald, in 1942 of Pasco's, quote, Negro problem, right? These hundreds of servicemen, where are they going to live? Who's going to watch them? Are they going to go out on the town? Are they going to go to Pasco restaurants?
Are women safe?
Are they going? The greatest fear of white supremacy,
Yeah.
right, is there going to be miscegenation?
Yes.
Are they going to try to date white women?
Right.
Right. Local girl, so all of these, and that's not a Southern. This is important to note that this racism, segregation, it's not a Southern thing. It erupted here when local whites felt the need to control peoples they saw as outsiders. You see this in the city council minutes. You see it in the past. People are concerned. The Navy's making all these promises. Oh, we're gonna build them a separate club, and we're gonna build them their own pool, so that they don't use the white pool in town. You know, stuff like that, right? Because you know, so Jim Crow-like segregation pops up here in response, even in Washington, where segregation is not the law of the land. Right, there's no legal mechanism for segregation in Washington. It becomes de facto, right?
So, by what means? Local police?
By the means of local police, realtors, elected officials, local businesses,
concerned citizens.
right? It's the diffusion of power of white supremacy, right? And I
without
can't,
the actual Jim Crow laws.
but Jim Crow practices,
Right.
de facto, and this is important to note how. And I keep saying that some people flinch at that, or they flinch at ideas of white privilege, but you look at the history and you see how the mere presence of people triggers a reaction and assumption about them before they've done anything.
Yeah.
That's all you can call it.
Carry a camera in public.
That's all you can call it is racism, right?
Yeah.
And this belief of supremacy, and inferiority, because with a belief of inferiority has to come supremacy, right? You can't think someone's inferior without thinking
you
of
being
themselves as
superior.
right. Exactly. So,
There
okay,
would be no reason to put them there.
that's right. So that's a big thing, but that's still several hundred. Enter Hanford. So when Hanford is selected as the site of plutonium production.
So now, coming back, the Navy Air Base, they lived in East Pasco?
No, they lived out on the base,
Okay,
but they
were
were
just
worried.
present.
They were, because they had time off and they could go shopping and they had money.
Right.
Here's people being paid close to equal. They want to go out on the town.
They weren't corralled at
right?
all.
These are young men who have money to burn on the weekend, right?
And a job, good job,
right? And there they are strutting around in their uniforms,
right?
Good. You could see how this would be, that you could see given the racial attitudes, of American society writ large. It's just racism doesn't exist in practice in this community before that population arrives, because there was no need by people here to feel anxious or triggered, right? And that speaks to them, things they're taught and believe, and the things left out of their education.
The whole landscape,
and So anyway, enter Hanford. So we get Hanford's chosen by the Army Corps. DuPont's chosen as the contractor. They know they have to hire. They know they're going to hire tens of thousands of people. In fact, DuPont ends up hiring 120,000 people, about 50,000 of which are here at any one time. And because it's a federal defense contract, DuPont has to follow some new laws. In 1938, in a way to try to address criticism by civil rights leaders, by J. Philip Randall and others, Franklin Delano Roosevelt puts together the Fair Employment Practices legislation, which creates the Fair Employment Practices Commission, FEPC.
Was that during wartime?
No, it's during 1938, so it's late New Deal, because a lot of the New Deal, this period of American history from 1933, there's two, but there's a first and a second. These are things like the CCC, the Public Works Administration, the Works Progress Administration, this massive building of infrastructure around the United States, and all these things to try to lift the U.S. out of the Depression. The way the federal government got conservative Democrats and some Republicans on board is that the federal government was largely just gave the money to the states to do what they wanted. And in the South, that meant that southern states could use New Deal money in a way that they wanted, which was routinely to deny it to blacks. And there were other concessions made to Southern Democrats. For example, Social Security, when it started, specifically excluded agricultural and domestic workers. Well, those are the number one jobs that African Americans had in the South. African American men were primarily engaged in agricultural work, and African American women, if they had employment outside the home, were primarily engaged in domestic work. Right? So by excluding those people, you're largely you're creating legislation that has race-based effects without race being the explicit reason. Right? But it's behind it. So to try to address some of that, Roosevelt's trying to get things in that will appease black civil rights activists, right? But while not alienating Southern Democrats, who he needs to pass all these other things.
Right.
Right. And so he creates the Fair Employment Practices Commission. And what this does is this says, look, if you get it's a commission that examines government contractors, government contracts, and the law says, look, if you get a government contract, your workforce has to be proportionately representative of the United States at large. So if you get a federal contract and the United States is roughly 15% African American, your workforce better be around that. Nothing so low as to trigger an investigation and possibly a fine or a cancellation of the contract. And since these contracts are pretty lucrative, companies are forced to. Now, that doesn't mean there's equality. This is very early affirmative action legislation. When DuPont's hiring African Americans, they're promising African American women they'll hire them as clerks, they're hiring them as domestic labor. African American men are largely hired for unskilled labor, right, as are a lot of whites. They're not hiring them as engineers, as scientists, right? Even though there are black engineers, they're not hiring them as permanent employees. But also this legislation, the FEPC, states you have to hire a percentage and you have to pay them equal to white workers of the same rank. So for black workers who had been in the South, who had routinely been paid fractions of what white workers made, this is a massive boon. For example, Vanis Daniels Sr.'s son, Vanis Jr., and another son, Edmund Daniels, still live here in the community today. They're in their 80s. I've interviewed both of them. They talked about how their father, Vanis Sr., who was from Kildare, Texas, East Texas, near Texarkana.
South.
Yeah, East Texas, right?
South, yeah.
They're actually very close to where Juneteenth, Texas is where Juneteenth is born, right? Galveston. So he was a sharecropper, as many African Americans were, and poor whites. Was a sharecropper and a brakeman on the Southern Pacific Railroad, and he supported 8 children and a couple cousins, a family of 10, on about $13 a week, plus whatever he could get from his sharecrop. He took a job with DuPont as the foreman of a labor gang, making about $1.25 an hour, working 60-hour weeks. So going from $13 a week to $68, $70 a week, I mean, that's massive.
Yeah.
That's a life-changing amount. Even if it's just for a year or two, that's possibly enough to really improve. And what that is just equality. Like it's just treating people equal for the first time in many of their lives.
Based on a white pay scale, how would that $1 an hour?
Oh, even for white workers in the South, that would have been great money. Still great money.
Yeah.
But it had to be paid. Now, there was still racism and segregation here. The Hanford site was segregated. The barracks were segregated. The mess halls were segregated. The job crews were segregated. And when
was that due to the military?
It's due to
the nature.
It's due to the nature.
Yeah.
It's what.
It's
The military was segregated and they planned it that way, but that's also what people expected.
Yeah.
And so, but when city leaders find out about DuPont bringing all these people in, they want a meeting with DuPont executives, and at this meeting, they demand that DuPont furnish any African American employee when they're done. They demand that DuPont furnish them a ticket home.
Oh my.
They don't want them staying. Right. Even though it's their right to stay.
Yeah.
But DuPont nominally agrees and never follows through. But it's clear city leaders are worried. This is also at the arrival at this time when thousands of African Americans, not just the hundreds of the Naval Air Station, but thousands are in the construction camp, but they're recreating in Pasco and Yakima. This is when you start to see a proliferation of segregated buses. We cater to white trade only signs. No Negroes and dogs allowed. All these kinds of signs begin to appear in Kennewick and Pasco. In East Pasco, which is overcrowded, slum-like conditions, is one of the only places in Tri-Cities where black workers can go to have any semblance of fair treatment.
I find it really interesting how everyone was relocated to here. Everyone, black,
pretty
white.
much. I mean, except for there were some people that were here already.
But that within this brand new confine, all that structure got put together for racism.
America has a long history of racial exclusion.
Yeah.
I mean, from our treatment of indigenous peoples to the fact that slavery existed in all 13 colonies, it gradually falls out of favor in the North, but
Right.
largely because it does not fall out of favor in the North because people were morally against slavery. It's because they were against slavery, but not on moral grounds. The anti-slavery movement in America was always much more powerful than the abolitionist movement. Anti-slavery movement says slavery is a threat to free men and the wages of free white men, because slaves compete for lower wages and enrich their white owners. It's an anti-monopoly type of movement. It's a class movement. It's not about racial equality. Most anti-slavery people, most of the Northerners that signed up to fight for the Union Civil War were anti-slavery. They wanted to free slaves and then have them stay in the South or ship them back to. They did not want them as free blacks competing with whites. But they recognized that even that would be better than slavery, because slavery allowed those with wealth to purchase human beings, to make more wealth, and to destroy the ability of free white men to get a fair wage. That's the real motivator. And so also it's easy to see why that same type of thing can happen here, where for a lot of people it's about status and anxiety. What is free black labor? What does that mean, right? Based on people's latent racial feelings, seeing free blacks conflicts with their idea of their own status, right? It's this perceived loss of status. At that time, to see an African American having equal wages,
that somehow makes
says something
them a less status.
Right, and that's it's horrible, but that's simply the culture. I mean, look at the way that African Americans were written out of everything at that time, right? Not in the history books. Their labor was undervalued, their history was undervalued. I mean, it's the prerogative of the overarching society to create this. Every state had laws against interracial marriage. Why? Because that white supremacy is baked into all these legal codes and the way people treat other people, which is also why we're still having these battles today. We still need to recognize always need to recognize Juneteenth, but it's so important. And when we think of things like George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, it's why we're still having these battles and why we're still having the pushback to those battles, right? Because there's still parts of our of our institutions and things that still have some of those latent structures in them.
Yeah, and the hard part is sometimes we can be totally unaware
Right.
of those things and go along with the program without realizing that there's
and it's often done really perniciously. It's often done in ways that's not meant to draw attention to itself, which makes it hard to remember. For example, here in Eastern Washington, even in this community, there's been really good work by Eastern Washington University about looking at racial covenants in Eastern Washington. How many homes have them? And here in Tri-Cities, there are several hundred homes that have in their title deeds that they are not to be occupied by someone who is non-white.
Whoa.
Right? And what's crazy is they're in older neighborhoods that are now majority non-white.
Yeah.
And that legal language is no longer enforced, but the fact it was put there when it was a white community communicates the status anxiety I'm talking about, communicates ideas of white supremacy, and that these things, and I'm not saying like we're a horribly racist society that can't change, but I would agree with the idea of critical race theory in that we need to work to reshape institutions and structures to be more equitable, to do better to address some of the inequalities that the past has created, because inequalities once created persist unless we actively remedy them, right? And that takes the work now. That's why the work now is so important. It's not about saying, oh, that's racist and this is racist, we should feel bad about it. It's about saying there's work we need to do to address the past, because the past carries over to the present and the future, right? Why does the average black family have a fifth of the wealth of the average white family? Why is black home ownership less than half of that of white home ownership? These are structural inequalities that we got to deal with it. Why are African Americans proportion of the prison population so much higher than whites, even though African Americans and whites commit crimes at roughly the same rate, right? These kind of things. We gotta do something.
Yeah.
And it's not about making anybody feel bad.
No.
It's about knowing the history and taking steps to to address it, but also to uplift like the positive things that we can do, that we should do, and the good work we've seen, right? It's about getting to the better. Anyway, so let's go back. Sorry, I always...
No, you're good, man. I love it.
I just would want people reading this to be like, oh, here's this history professor who's like critical, you know, and no, we got to do better. We got to do better.
That's what I totally appreciate about it.
And we have the power to do better because we've seen in the past when people have taken the stand and made the right choice.
That history becomes really vital at that point.
It does. And that's why we should celebrate things like Juneteenth. To me, it's funny, so few people know this holiday, right? And it's part of it's in the middle of summer, so it's not a school holiday, but what is more positive than celebrating the end? We should have never had slavery, but it was ended, right? And that is a positive thing that happened where we should look at it and reflect to say, what other positive changes could we make to improve the lives of people? You know, but it is, I mean, what better thing to celebrate than, you know, to me, I mean, I love hot dogs and fireworks. July 4th to me, and I think to most people that would understand the history of Juneteenth, 4th of July is an incomplete holiday.
Totally.
Because America was founded as a slave society on the backs of slave labor. And so to me, Juneteenth is kind of like, that's starting to cash in, not fully, but we're starting to realize the promise of July 4th. And there's a lot of people that want to use history for their own political ends, whether they, and sometimes they're good, sometimes they're devious. You know, I mean, look at the way fascist totalitarian governments rewrite history all the time. It's so powerful how we tell it, which is why you have these battles about CRT in schools and libraries and all this stuff, because to withhold knowledge is the easiest way to perpetuate inequality, or really to promote a certain worldview, is to take away challenges to it. Right? It's a very powerful thing to withhold knowledge, and I think that, you know, when we see people talking about banning books, and instead of educating people to more critically consume information, there's a lot of people that say, well, we want to withhold information, and that's bad. That's dangerous. Educate people and give them the tools to choose for themselves whether that information they're getting is good or bad. Right? That's freedom. That's the American. That's
how we grow.
That's democracy, man.
That's how we grow.
Like the alternative is not democracy.
No.
And that's you know, history's real. It's alive. So African Americans do come. They're asked to leave, but they don't, and they stay. And you alluded to part of the reason why. Well, first of all, Hanford after World War II, unlike all the other wartime plants, Hanford balloons. Right? You know, they built 3 reactors in World War II, 3 separations plants. By 1955, there's 8 reactors, right? And 2 more separations plants. And then there's dams, right? And one of the types of work that African American laborers were skilled at is concrete work. And hey, that's Hanford and dams. And those also, as government contracts, meant good jobs that people could raise families with. And that's why in 1950, Pasco is over 20% black, right? Over 2,000 African Americans live in a town of 10,000 people. That's a lot. That's a significant presence. Especially given that African Americans are like about 16% of the population of the United States then, and still somewhat concentrated in the South. And that's what makes Pasco, because this happens in Spokane and Portland. What makes Pasco interesting is that this is a relatively rural area, especially in 1950, and it's still, you know, it's not what you think of when you think of Washington. It's our 4th largest metro area, but it's not massive. But for people to come to this rural area is actually really interesting. But then, of course, you have all of the same things. You have segregation. You have basically a ghetto created in East Pasco. East Pasco, up through the mid-'60s, has almost no streetlights, no sewer system. People are sharing water taps. They're cooking with wood stoves and heating their home with wood. You know, meanwhile in Richland, you have this nice, shiny Alphabet House community that you've probably filmed and have talked about. That's happening. The government is constructing people brand new homes while people are living in dilapidated trailers or in tents in East Pasco, right? Because of their race. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
They're both working in Hanford, except that one group of people in East Pasco can't get the permanent jobs until the mid-60s. And that means that there's inequalities in education. Whittier School on the other side of Virgie Robinson here, where the Dollar General is. Whittier School de facto became a segregated school because it was a mostly black school, and it was the oldest school in Pasco, and the city was reluctant to bus people around because busing creates a lot of
mess, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, busing has real advantages for black and white students, but
Sure.
Status anxiety.
Exactly.
Well, I moved here because of the neighborhood, and you're going to bring these kids in here,
Right.
and that's just status anxiety.
Yeah.
It's the same old shit,
Yeah.
but just in a different language. Pardon my French.
It's a good channel.
Okay,
I don't care.
So, and there's civil rights movements here. There's NAACP. There's CORE, Congress
So
on
we're
Racial Equality.
Talking 59.
We're talking in World War II. There's an NAACP chapter at the
Really?
Hanford. Yes, and they brought Thurgood Marshall, or Thurgood Marshall becomes invested in this. That's future justice,
Right.
the Supreme Court.
Right.
Thurgood Marshall sends his secretary, his special investigator secretary, to Hanford to investigate the black situation at this government contract.
So
and they
sorry.
forced DuPont to get DuPont had been contracting bus service to a local company, Tri-City Busing, something like that, Twin City Busing. And that company had just segregated its buses without being told to.
Right.
Said, well, we got to segregate these buses.
Yeah.
That's just what we got to do.
Yeah.
And the thing is that Washington law banned segregation in public facilities. But yet, here's a company doing it out of practice. And the NAACP said, look, DuPont, we're gonna put you on blast. We're gonna sue if you don't do something about this. And they said, well, you can't sue, it's the war, and that would look bad. And they said, well, you got a choice then, desegregate the damn buses.
Right.
And they did, and that was an early civil rights victory. But you had, though, I mean, you talk to the old timers here. I've interviewed folks. You can see all this stuff in the oral histories that are up on our website.
Yeah, those oral histories, just to put in a side note, if you're cleaning your house or doing something, man, I love putting in some earpieces and just going mowing the yard, whatever, and just listening to some of these oral histories. There's hundreds, right? I mean, there's a lot of them.
Of the Hanford ones, yes. And then there's about 30 of these specifically Manhattan Project early Cold War African American oral histories that document the specific black experience.
I had to stop by the Morning Star Church
before
I got
landmark,
here.
Total landmark.
Yeah,
of this community. Yeah, absolutely.
Boy, is that thing beautiful.
It is.
Yeah.
And it's also a symbol of the importance of black churches, the community of black churches in the civil rights movement. Of course, church, one of the only place that slaves and then free blacks could gather legally without the threat of white violence, either police violence or just white mob violence. I mean, one of the only places where blacks could gather without the eyes of whites, right? Historically, and thus the role that churches specifically as an institution play in civil rights, because you could gather there without getting, and even then, right, there's still firebombing of churches,
sure.
and there's still, but largely it was a safe space from the days of slavery forward. And that shaped the character of black churches, but also why if you look at why many of the people and leaders of civil rights movements are connected to churches, a lot of it has to do with that history of that being a gathering space, a community space, more so than just for religious reasons, right?
Yeah.
It's a safe place. And it's also, Sunday was the only day that slaves didn't have to work.
Right.
So of course
Right.
many of them are going to convert to Christianity.
Right.
Even though many of them, especially in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, many of them hold on to a lot of African spiritual, indigenous African beliefs and practices. They kind of they mesh, right? They migrate them together.
And the gospel music's a prime example.
Of that,
how
right?
that flow happens.
Yeah, but especially if you went to a black church in the 18th or 19th centuries, you would see a lot more African tradition from the people who did that kind of accommodating of their two worlds, right? They kind of fused. It's fusion, right?
Yeah.
And one of the great things about this country is our history of fusion, whether it's whether it's culinary fusion, right? Linguistic fusion, music fusion, right? Rock and roll, hip hop, great examples of the positive power of fusion, both, of course, notably, right? I mean, so much of modern music today has its roots in African traditions. I mean, it's basically the bedrock of a lot of our, country, rock, rap. I mean, it's
that pop culture was
huge.
so heavily influenced by the African American. I mean, just the
still is
the Motown. It goes
the whole.
on and
I mean,
on
all
and
of
on.
it. Yeah, all of it. I mean, the Beatles and Rolling Stones, these kind of classic rock bands, right? Got their start covering music by black artists, right? They imported race records into Britain, right? They changed their lives, and they went on to, sadly, to eclipse the people that influenced them by far. I mean, the people got very little. They usually had to sell their records for, Big Mama Thornton, the original performer and writer of Hound Dog, sold that record for like $50.
Oh my!
And of course we all know Elvis made his whole career off of appropriating black artists, but anyway, that's the dark side of the fusion, right? Is the approach anyway. So here in Pasco, there's this distinct East Pasco community that is full of black small businesses, hotels and after hours clubs and restaurants and things. And it's a thriving black community, but it's there because of exclusion, because black residents can't go. They can go shop at the JCPenney, but they can't try any clothes on. They can't go eat at the restaurants, right? If they go in the movie theater, they might be asked to sit in a certain section. They can't get a job with the city, right? The city, the city will take their application. They'll, as Webster Jackson told me, he applied for a job. The lady took his application, and as he walked out of the building, he saw her just throw it in the trash.
Filed it.
She filed it.
Filed it.
And that at CBC, CBC would begrudgingly sometimes not enroll black students because even though they had a high school diploma, they said, well, your school couldn't possibly have educated you to the standards of college. You have to take remedial classes to prove to us that things like that were commonplace in this community, and thus groups like NAACP, CORE, Congress on Racial Equality, and others, they formed to challenge this segregation, right? They formed, and there's many leading lights of this. Katie Barton, Art Fletcher, who was here for a number of years. He later went on to be Nixon's special advisor for civil rights, and he lead the United Negro College Fund. He's considered the father of affirmative action, the rare black Republican, which is why he went to work for Nixon. He's the one that, he didn't coin it, but he was the head of United Negro College Fund when they came out with the motto, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste." I'm sure you remember that. Classic.
TV commercials.
Who's, I think Dan Quayle said, it's a terrible thing to waste one's mind.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
do you remember that? Some of your audience remembers the Dan Quayle years.
I do remember that.
Yeah, me too. I mean, not much, but as a historian, I always loved to tell students my favorite Dan Quayle-isms. But anyway, so Katie Barton, Art Fletcher, Dan Carter and James Pruitt, who helped to open up the Matrix building, this black self-help co-op that was an incubator for black small business. That's now the Salon Playa, just over here. And let's talk about for a second, we haven't talked about it yet, let's talk about where we are. Right? We're in Kurtzman Park. Now, Kurtzman is a white guy, but he's a guy that donated the land for this park. The story of this park is that neighborhood children, Vanis Daniels, one of them, who's also another really important person in this history, who's been interviewed a number of times. Vanis Daniels and some friends were playing here when this was a vacant lot. They say there was, gravel and and brush and like jackrabbits in here. They were playing here, and a woman happened to walk by who wasn't kind of looking at some of the conditions here, and she said, "Don't you boys have a place to play?" And they said, "Well, not in East Pasco. We have to go 14 blocks over to get to the nearest park." And she said, "Well, that's a shame." And so she went to the city and looked up where this land belonged to, and saw it was owned by a Mr. Kurtzman, who owned the land, but he lived in Seattle. And she drafted a letter to him and said, "Would you consider donating the land to build a park?" And Kurtzman said, "Look, I won't donate to a person or an organization, but I'll donate it to the city if the city will build a park." And the city said, "Well, we'll take the land, but we just don't have the ability to build a park." So the community, the kids, the parents, all came together and said, we'll build the park. And for weeks, months, the community, the black community came down here and dug the lines to put in the irrigation pipes. They planted, they were given the grass seed, but they had to plant it themselves. They created this entire park from a vacant lot. And then in the early 19th, this was in the mid 50s, the early 1960s, the black community, Luz L. Johnson, former connected with Morningstar Baptist, also really important in the person's history, Luz L. Johnson, Vance Daniels, built that building behind us. This building was built by the black community. It's not built by the city. This was built as a park building for the community to have a gathering space. This park is the perfect place to host Juneteenth because this is built by the sweat of the African American community. Full stop. Right? The city manages it today, but full stop. This is an expression of self-help, right? But also of a community
out of nothing.
A community that had to build its own park because it had so little, and they were not considered worthy of a green space, right? And so they built it themselves and forced the city to take care of it. And of course now the city does a great job taking care of it, and it's a very important park, but this is a legacy of that exclusion and that resistance to the exclusion. That's why I titled my second book Echoes of Exclusion and Resistance, because all through the Tri-Cities you see those two things in tension. Right. And this is that resistance. But that resistance manifests itself because of the exclusion. Right?
They wouldn't have been there without it.
They're intimately tied, right?
Yeah.
We can't talk about where we've come without talking about where we've been.
Yeah.
It's an incomplete story.
Yeah. Cause and effect.
And so that's why this is so important. I mean, Juneteenth here is just there's no other place quite like it, right? And a lot of that history has kind of been lost over time, but this is such an important space.
But I think that you and others and all the people that contributed to the Atomic Heritage and the interviews have brought so much of that back.
Yeah.
For consumption,
right?
That would have totally been lost.
But now this community is totally different. It's 87% Latinx, right? And so it's now their park, largely. But it's
I walked down to Morningstar. I got into the neighborhood and went, I don't know this neighborhood.
Yeah.
I should have probably looked at the map, But everybody was nice.
I mean, the thing is, it's a totally safe place.
Yeah.
It's a normal place.
No, everyone was very nice.
But I'll tell you, when I first moved here in 2015, people told me not to look at homes here, it wasn't safe to be in East Pasco. My kids go to daycare here. They've been going to daycare here for 5 years almost. Yeah. In fact, my son's about to graduate from the daycare here, and my daughter will still go, but I'm here every day almost.
Yeah.
And this is a wonderful place, wonderful people. One of the things I'm really happy about is the city is about to set to do over $1 million of renovations to the Martin Luther King Jr. Community Center over here to really bring it up into the 21st century, rehabilitate some of and kind of reconfigure some of the inside to hopefully have some better indoor soccer facilities, which is really what a lot of the kids in this community want now, which makes sense. And just redo that, and it's really exciting to see the city invest in that. And the city, to its credit, has really been working to engage with this history, right? Because historically the city did not do a good job.
Yet, or is that still open?
Well, no, tunnel's closed. So you got the overpass, which is you still have the problem of infrastructure here. This will always be a separate part of Pasco.
Because of the rail trail.
Because, you can't do anything about that. But it doesn't have to be.
Well, on the highway too, I guess.
Right. It doesn't have to be, and this is also a great thing about how highways divide us, how they segregate us, how they shape how we talk about places and what areas get services. I mean, it matters a lot.
Yeah.
Right. We look at where they chose to put interstates through in major cities through black neighborhoods. Right. Which whites had recently left for the suburbs. Right. So that history is really well documented.
It's always a busy.
And there's redlining, and there's reasons why blacks couldn't leave city, and all this stuff. But that stuff matters, and there's ways there's not a lot you can do about 395, or not a lot you can do about the railroad tracks. They're there, but there is a lot you can do about recognizing the history of the community, the vibrancy, and most importantly, investing in the community so that East Pasco is just a geographic designation. Right. It's not a separate place. Because it's too long been a zone of othering, right? Of the wrong side of the tracks. right?
With a lot of awful nicknames.
Yeah,
That's
its history, but it doesn't have to be its reality. But we gotta acknowledge a curve, and that's why earlier when we were talking, you mentioned about the Green Bridge. You just learned about it.
Yeah.
That's why to me it's inappropriate to not have a marker somewhere on. There's two different places where the Green Bridge is interpreted in this community, and nowhere is there a place that talks about it as Kennewick being a sundown town historically, as there being a sign. That's important for people to know, because then we can talk about how that was resisted and changed. And
that was up till 1968?
1965 is when the first black family moved into Kennewick, yeah. Thomas Moore, whose son Leonard, and Leonard's wife Vanessa, who is a Mitchell, Cedar Mitchell, they're the head of ACCESS, the African American Community Cultural Education Society.
How great is it they got to dismantle that bridge?
It's
they
really
salvaged
great.
It.
I know. They salvaged it and brought it over to where it is, but there's no marker about how that bridge. They talk about the engineering. It's part of the Yellowstone Trail and yada yada. To me, that's footnote level shit, right? That's a little. What's important to me is about how that bridge was a site of exclusion, how police patrolled that bridge, how it's part of the story of civil rights in the North, and Jim Crow and civil rights and resistance, but also like that helps us talk about a community today that's also split along racial lines, right? Or talk about the situations today. It makes the history alive. It makes it relevant, and we need that. We need that knowledge of our past.
Yeah.
Not
as a reminder of shame,
right.
or that, but more as a reminder of celebration. Look, man, it's not there now.
Right, it's not there now.
And I'm glad it's not.
History's complicated. We have to have these things in tension.
Yeah.
Right, we have to talk about the bad and the good.
Right.
We need it there. We need to talk about how that bridge came down, how that sign came down, how that community opened up. We also need to talk about it, though, to remind ourselves that things like white supremacy and racism are not isolated incidents. Racism isn't just a racist thing people say or an act of evil in an other. It's much more diffused and basic than that. It's much more ingrained in that, and it comes through in people's actions, in their beliefs, in the way they act. It comes through in where governments and businesses invest their money and who they hire. It's a practice, right? It's not just an isolated thing, and so we need to know how that functions historically to understand how to deal with it when it happens today, because it's
or even recognize it today.
Yeah, to even recognize
because
it
it's
today.
Even more hidden now than ever before.
Except when it comes to the fore, but a lot of times our media and people treat it as isolated incidents of this bad thing happened. But what led up to that? What told someone they could behave that way? How might they have been supported in that line of thinking? Right? What are they consuming that reflect? Because people are taught it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
People are taught the assumption.
Thing.
No, it's not.
No,
it's not.
So.
But it. So, if we're still seeing to me, it's like it's the thing between the symptom and the disease, right? If we're still seeing the symptom, then we still have an infection.
Yeah.
Right. And it might look different, but part of dealing with that is looking at the past and saying, and recognizing, the good and the bad. Right, and being able to take stock and but a day like Juneteenth, remembering how celebratory this is, but also as a way to reflect that it's also as a deeper meaning, and it should impact us beyond Juneteenth.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, oh, here's Black History Month. Well, every other every month should be Black History Month, or like every other white month is white.
Right.
And that's true. It's like we have these days and things, but really it needs a. No, we have to be vigilant all the time, but my hope is that it sparks some kind of, this knowledge sparks just us to think and reflect and kind of, like in our lives, do things when we see something racist or wrong to kind of call attention to that before it erupts. And, Irving Brown, the guy that helped organize this today in these Juneteenth events, his campaign signs were vandalized last year. I was on the NPR talking about it. People scrawled the N-word on it. you know, and all this stuff. And he had calls at City Hall, people threatening to kill him and, you know, kill that N-word. And like, you know, this history still has purchase, right? It's still relevant. It's still important. I mean, it'll always be there, but like, you know, this is stuff we really got to get out to people.
Right.
You know, they need to know.
Right.
Because the history here is it had the potential to improve, and in some cases did improve housing conditions for some, but not for everybody. People want to have the rows covered. You know, they don't want to think that their parents or people they knew were part of a system that,
Right.
you know, and that makes it hard to talk about a lot of these things. But, you know, it's important to.
But it doesn't necessarily make them bad people. It just makes them part of that system.
Yeah,
You know?
it starts to get a little troubling when they try to kind of resist, like, or they try to make excuses for the past. It's like, no, just look, that's the way it was. Like you were a kid, you didn't do it.
Right.
Don't feel bad about it.
Right.
And if you feel bad about it, that's a soul searching thing for you.
And if you do feel bad about it, maybe you should do something encouraging towards that cause so you don't feel bad about it.
Right. Maybe you should learn
Why
more
not?
about it and understand the way that like your parents might have benefited from a system that was set up to benefit white homeowners and white families, you know, and understand that when you see, you know, people struggling today, that it's maybe not a personal failing so much as it is a structural failing.
Right.
But yeah, so East Pasco today though is still, you know, it is still it's still a community, just it's one that is, you know, it's overwhelmingly Hispanic. And Pasco today too, you go to downtown Pasco, I mean, it reflects it reflects the history since 1970, right? But it also, one that is arguably just as, if not, you know, Latinx residents have faced segregation. They've largely worked these low-skilled, underpaid positions. They're the inheritors of this history.
I don't understand.
So in academia, we often say it as a gender-neutral way to talk about a people.
To be general neutral.
But it's not a term that the community
Instead
uses.
of Latino.
Yes.
Right.
It's often a term that academics use to talk about it without signifying a gender. It is not a term that people of that community use to describe themselves.
Okay. I wonder.
There's not been general consensus on the best term.
Yeah.
You can say Latina, A, O, but it's often just like, I'll just use it just in an attempt to be inclusive. Right. I think that's the spirit of it, is inclusion.
Okay.
However, it's not used by the community, so it's not authentic. It kind of sucks.
I'm just curious.
I don't love it, but I don't really know what's better.
No, I'm not. I didn't understand.
You'll hear people that hate the term. You'll hear people like me that'll just kind of be like, "Well, I want to be inclusive."
No, I heard it and went, "Well, I don't know what that means."
So until there's a term, or until there's like some guidance, I'm going to try to do the thing that's the most inclusive.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. That's a call out there for somebody to fix this fight. It's like land acknowledgements.
Right.
You know, they often are perfunctory and not really serious. They're often just there to kind of assuage guilt, and no one understands what does the land acknowledgement mean if there's no intent behind it.
Right.
It's the same issue that bedevils academia, because we'll have these land acknowledgements. Oh, this sits on stolen land. All right, well, what have you done about that?
Right.
Acknowledging it's just the first step, dog.
Yeah.
Like, what are you gonna do? Not saying you have to give it back, but like, have you done anything? Right. And some universities do. Some universities really invest and try and actually, address that wrong. And some, usually corporations, but some universities just are like, we have a land acknowledgement now. You're like, congratulations, it's literally the least you could do. People on the res are still suffering the most of any people in the, anyway. So, now this community is, and my co-author of the Echoes of Exclusion book, Bob Bauman, who also wrote this excellent article called Jim Crow in the Tri-Cities, wrote it 20 years ago. We started a Latinx oral history project, but it was small grants and we didn't have a ton of money, and it ended up being such a big project we couldn't do it just ourselves. So it's kind of on hiatus until we can figure out who we could partner with to make it more and bring the resources it deserves. But story of what's happening now, what's been happening in the last few decades, really since 1960, 1970, with the major changes in Franklin County and Pasco, is just as important as this other history, and arguably maybe more so because of the numbers of people here and who it impacts.
Yeah.
And it's also important to me because at WC Tri-Cities, and I know over at CBC, more than half of our students are first generation. More than half of our students are Latinx, Latino, Latina. And so that history of their community is right here, and it goes back decades and decades and decades. And it's really important. And it talks about these large-scale changes, and there's segregation, and there's resistance, and there's this growth of Latinx business, and the way they're shaped. I mean, this is the next generation that's going to shape this area and shape business and make the decisions, and that's really, and I try to bring that in and kind of carry over from my work with the Black history into this Latinx history and kind of merge it because it's the East Pasco is still talked about as this non-white space, right? It's still the continuation of the story, but it's also like really you can look at this community and it's not that you don't have to think of it as two separate communities. It's kind of a transition,
right?
But it's the same issues, it's the same attitudes in some ways, but it's so relevant for all these young kids today, right? And people who are coming here as first generation migrants, right, who are also caught up in this vicious political debate that we're having about, belonging, right? And migration, and the same rhetoric about that people who deserves to be here and who doesn't.
Right.
Man, that has deep roots.
It is.
That was talked about the Black community here. They don't deserve to be here. Send them tickets back to where they're from.
Yeah. Same concept.
Same
right?
shit, man.
Yeah. Same concept.
Same shit.
Same pattern.
Yeah. So this is a beautiful changing dynamic place. The first, what we consider modern migration, is during the Mexican Civil War, and that is 1910 through 1920. World War I stops it a bit. And then the Depression stops stuff for a while because we actually deport a lot of Mexicans, including like 100,000 Mexican Americans who are like American citizens. But it's horrible. It's so fucked up. Yeah, and this is why Trump's talk about deporting people now is like eerily reminiscent of when we fucked up and we deported over 100,000 American citizens to a foreign country. Oh, it's horrible, dude. It's a totally different discussion, but it's horrible.
That's horrible. I gotta look into that.
You should look into it. It's really fucked up.
Whoa.
So anyway, so the Mexican Revolution is the seeds. So there are folks that migrated and actually settled up near Toppenish in the Yakima Valley.
Yep.
And so there's a Mexican community there, that goes back to the 1920s, and that's also where you start to see Mexicans migrating to other parts of the United States. Small numbers, but that's really some of the first migration out of the American Southwest, right? Yeah. And then in World War II, Colonel Franklin Matthias's General Leslie Groves' guy at Hanford, he talks about hiring like several hundred Mexicans for the Manhattan Project, but we don't know much about them. The park is doing a research project about them right now, so stay tuned.
Did that happen?
We might know. Yeah, it did. They brought up some Mexicans, but we think that they were actually Mexican American. We think they were like Hispanic speaking Americans from like New Mexico, so they were already American citizens, but they were considered Mexican because they're non-white. But look, man, America's been a Hispanic country since we went to war with Mexico and took a bunch of the former Spanish Empire.
California,
so
Texas,
fucking Florida, baby. Like we've been a Hispanic country for a long time. Spanish has been a second language, has been an official language in what's now America for a long time. Really predating America. Anyway, but then in the 50s, so the Bracero program in World War II is really the first larger scale migration. And that starts during World War II when farmers need labor in the American Southwest, but actually all over the US. And so there's contracts are set up with the Mexican government where farmers agree on like location and wages and work schedule. And Mexican nationals, always just men, are allowed to migrate temporarily to work in America, and then they have to leave. But here's the thing. Even during the Bracero program, the amount of labor needed did not match the amount of people allowed to be in the program. So there was illegal migration because there was the desire for it, because the jobs were needed. Also, many people wanted to bring their families. They didn't want to leave their wives and children without a male head of household, possibly in dangerous situations. So women, and a lot of farmers looked the other way because they probably got some free extra labor for it. Farmers, people hiring, I don't even like using them, people hiring immigrant labor have always liked to look the other way because they benefit financially from it, right? And this is, you know, it's yeah, and which is why all these attitudes about it are really jacked up. So that's happening, and the Bracero program ends in 1964, but there's no provision for legal immigration. So you ended the program that brought the temporary labor, but
no papers.
The need for the jobs didn't disappear, and that's where you have large scale, you start to get increasing levels of migration. And that's also where you get, before the end of Bracero, most migrants went back to Mexico. But at the end of that, people started to stay because the jobs were here, and why take the chance of migrating your family across the border, a dangerous place where you could be caught by federales or you could be caught by border patrol. Why take that chance? Just stay, even if it's illegal, just stay and make more money here. The schools are probably better. You know, you can eke out a living better than in Mexico or, you know, Central America.
A whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah. So that's where people, and it's in the 1960s that people begin to stay. And it slowly grows. And then, of course, you know, amnesty, Reagan's amnesty, legalized a bunch of people, but also, you know, again, there's still more labor needed. And then you have, of course, like, you know, just continuing levels of migration. And, you know, it totally transforms Eastern Washington, especially. I mean, Franklin County is a majority Hispanic Latinx county.
Right.
You know, only one in Washington, but it's massive.
Be there,
in Benton County, it's not majority, but it's I think it's up to like 38%, you know, Latinx, which is large, right? It's like more than twice what blacks were, in this period of high migration. So in the 1950s. So yeah, it's huge. But there's still jobs here. There's still safety here. We need labor. We don't have. Americans aren't having enough children to keep up with. But
we're not.
And
we can't hold this together.
And we're supposedly this beacon of freedom and democracy. And you know, I mean, I have my own. You know, obviously, I'm a pretty liberal guy, and if people want to come and live a good life here, I'm totally for that. People don't leave their homes lightly, you know, and I tend to give them the benefit of the doubt. But it does. But either way, right? Legal, authorized or, you know, unauthorized migration. I don't like saying illegal because it's just like the fact that borders exist is just a construction of the state. There's nothing inherently like bad.
And
you know,
people have migrated forever.
And some borders we don't give a shit about. You can cross from Washington to Oregon and like nothing happens to you. So it's all just a construction, like race. But you know, whether which side it is, right? It's totally reshaping this place and you know, I think in a really great way. The Tri-Cities is vibrant.
It is
because of this, you know, because of so many people want to move here and stay here, and it really makes me happy to see how many the children of these migrants, whether they're first generation or second generation, like they want to go to school here and become leaders here, and, you know, entrepreneurs or nurses. You know, they want there's this real, you know, pride of community. That's really important for us to nurture and nourish, and important history to recognize. And it's really the continuation. But the Mexican presence, you know, Mexican Latinx has been over 100 years in Washington. You know, small but significant.
Well, I think that's about it, Robert.
Awesome.
You have just freaking nailed it, dude. I just so appreciate.
Of course. Well, I appreciate you asking me to come out and.